Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are talking about The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is a show that came out in 2025, so this year. And it's also a book of the same name by Richard Flanagan, which came out in 2013. And it was the winner of the Man Booker Prize in 2014. But the show is written by Sean Grant and directed by Justin Kurzel. You can watch this show on Amazon Prime if you're lucky. It's a fictional story about the life of Australian surgeon Dorrigo Evans before, during, and after his time as a POW in a Japanese internment camp in a Chai jungle, where they were forced to build the Burma Railway, also known as the Death Railway. And you can also check out our episode about Bridge on the River Kwai, which features the very same railway. The title comes from an early 18th century travel diary written in a style that combines poetry and prose called haiban. The poet, Matsuo Basho, wrote about an epic and dangerous road trip he had taken that spanned 1,500 miles. Two Japanese officers in the book discuss Basho's work, and at one point in the show, Dorrigo is gifted an English translation by a Japanese delegation. It's an apology for his time in the POW camp. What did you think of the show?
Well, I read the book first and I sort of stalled out around a third of the way through. And then I came back to it and I did end up finishing it. And I did end up enjoying the remainder of the book. It kind of picked up for me. And then the things that I did start to enjoy about the book, there's quite a lot of supporting characters that we get a lot of insight into, but only based on the perception of the main character for the most part. And there's also quite a lot of symbolism and stuff. And I feel like they tried to carry that over into the show, but it's pretty difficult, I think, to do some of those things to give us kind of like an in-depth character study and to completely convey what the characters are thinking and feeling when you are making a television show or a movie based on a book that's pretty like introspective. So the show wasn't my favorite. I probably won't watch it again. I thought that the acting was pretty decent and there were definitely parts of it that were emotionally impactful, but overall it was a little grim. It was really dark, and I mean that in a literal sense. It was hard to see what was going on a lot of the time. And yeah, there was lots of little character moments from the book that didn't necessarily get picked up in the show. Not my favorite, I think. What about you?
I have trouble saying this, but I love this show. I thought it was really good. And it is really dark, both literally and figuratively. I can't say that I enjoyed it. Like, it wasn't a joyful thing to watch at all, but I thought it was really good. And I have not read the book, so that's probably also something that's influenced my like of it. But everybody in the show seems kind of trapped in their circumstances and everybody's miserable. And I don't know why I would like this show. It doesn't seem like a show that I would like normally, but I did. I thought the acting was great. Maybe I was just in the mood for something really fucking grim, because it's really fucking grim. Some parts of it were hard to watch from an emotional point of view, were hard to watch, and others, like you said, you can't fucking see what's going on. So many hard to watch scenes. But yeah, I just kind of really enjoyed it in a kind of morbid way. I don't know, I think I will watch it again because I feel like there's more to be discovered from it in the second watch, maybe. I wonder if I will feel differently after reading the book, because we've talked about the show a lot and the book after we both seen the show, and a lot of things are quite different from the book, so that's what's gotten me really interested in reading it. I feel like if I enjoyed the show without reading the book, then I'm definitely gonna enjoy reading the book if there's a lot more character stuff going on in there. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah, I definitely think it'll give you a greater depth of understanding, maybe. And You'll probably still like the show. You'll just have different thoughts and opinions on it. As you said, we talked about some of it offline. And as always, I think when they make changes from books to TV shows or movies, some of them make sense to me and I get it. It's for streamlining the narrative, etc. And then some of the changes they made, I was like, but I feel like that changes the meaning and I'm not 100% sure why they did it. Perhaps that was part of my ambivalence about the show.
Yeah, and I guess from a movie making perspective, I really liked some of the narrative choices in a way that the show flips forward and backward between before the war, during the war, and after the war. And they made some interesting parallels in the storytelling, which I thought were quite nice to see, and things that I appreciate a lot. And then on the other end of that, there's just scenes that are so brutal that you can barely look at the screen. And it's a brave choice, I think, to be so blatant about the violence that's going on in the story. I can't say I really enjoyed it, but I do think it's a brave choice.
Yeah, and we'll certainly talk about arguably the worst scene in both the book and the movie a little later on.
I need to know, did you cry?
No, I did not.
I did.
Yeah, that's valid. It was a pretty rough, I don't even know how long it was, but it felt long.
It felt long. I'm sure it felt longer than it was. All right, let's get into the plot.
All right, so there's 5 episodes. In episode 1, we start off in Syria in 1941, and we get our group introduction to our main character, Dorrigo Evans, played by Jacob Elordi, as well as a lot of the soldiers that he served with, who will be spending a lot of time with him in the POW camp later. And so they are, in no particular order, Frank Gardner, played by Thomas Weatherall, Rooster McNeese, played by Sam Parsonson, Tiny, played by David Howell, Jimmy Bigelow, played by Edward Guile, Chum Fahey, played by Kaylin McCarthy, and Sheephead Morton, played by Fabian McCallum. And the reason why they're in Syria is because Australian troops, as well as Free French and Indian troops, were engaged in the Allied campaign in the summer of 1941 to overthrow the Vichy French government in Syria and Lebanon. They thought there would only be token resistance, but the fighting ended up being really bloody and intense. And the Allies were ultimately victorious, and an armistice was signed on July 14th. So that's where we're starting off, right in the middle of a war zone.
I thought the opening was quite confusing because it kind of opens with them just bantering in very Australian voices. And it seems kind of all chummy and all good. And then someone takes a kid somewhere and they step on a landmine, and you're like, oh, wait a second, this is not a chummy movie.
And honestly, again, with the literal darkness, if I hadn't known that that's what was happening from the scene in the book, I would have probably had to rewind and watch again because I was like, wait, what is happening? It is so dark.
I think I watched the first episode and like the half of the second episode, and I was like, wait a second, I'm not going to enjoy myself if I keep watching this during the day in the sunlight. So let's wait for nightfall.
Yeah. I love on a movie set when they turn, a single light on, it's like we can still understand that it's meant to be nighttime or it's meant to be dark if you light it in the way they traditionally light movies at night. Like it doesn't have to be so dark we can't see anything.
I'd like to refer all movie making people to Band of Brothers. That's where they still knew how to do it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
12 months later, we get a little skip forward. We are introduced to Dorrigo's fiancée, Ella, played by Olivia de Jonge, which is an Australian name that I think must have been Dutch at one point. But we meet Ella because she's speaking on the phone to Dorrigo's uncle's wife, Amy Mulvaney, played by Odessa Young, after Dorrigo is MIA. And this scene, then, it's so weird because you don't know yet what's going on. Amy is like, I'm sure he'll call you soon. It's such an awkward scene. It's like, what's going on? Why are they? What's happening here?
Yeah. And it's the first of kind of quite a lot of flipping around in time you do during the show and the book as well. I think one of the things the show did well is that I found it pretty easy to follow, like where you are in the timeline and that kind of stuff.
I wasn't confused about this at all. Like, I've seen other people on the internet being confused about it. I'm like, why? It's pretty clear to me. But I will say, in a slight variation of our usual saying, all these white girls look the same.
Really? I was able to tell them apart because one of them had red hair and one of them was blonde.
Except in one scene where you thought they were smashing and it was definitely the other person.
Yeah, but I think I was confused because in the book, that's what happened. So,
I do like that we get not one but two female characters that are a major part of the plot. I thought that was good, even though they're there for the main character, which is annoying. But at least they get lots of dialogue and they get to carry all the emotional weight of this show, I think.
yeah, for sure. Dorrigo was taken prisoner at the Battle of Java, which was a naval battle in the Pacific that culminated in the Japanese invading the Dutch-held island of Java, which was part of Indonesia, on February 28, 1942. It was a terrible defeat for the Allies, resulting in Japanese supremacy in the Pacific for quite a while. Over 82,000 Allied POWs were taken, including almost 5,000 Australians.
It's another one of those stories that I don't really know from any schooling I've had. Even though you would think, right, that it's a Dutch-held island. I should know about this, but I've never been taught this part of history.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, generally speaking, reading up on what the Australians were up to in World War II for this episode, I learned a lot because I didn't know very much.
It's nice like that.
Yeah. Many years later, we get introduced to older versions of our main characters. So we meet older Ella, played by Heather Mitchell, and older Dorrigo, played by Kieran Hines. And Dorrigo is being interviewed about his time as a POW, and we start to get a sense of the way other people's perception of him as a war hero has shaped his life. And that's kind of a factor in what you were saying earlier about all the characters feeling trapped. He very much is trapped in this idea that other people have of him. And he's working on a book about his experiences with his fellow POW, Rabbit Hendricks, played by William Lauder. Well, Rabbit Hendricks' drawings, because Rabbit Hendricks did not survive the war. So he's working on this book, and it's kind of dragged his military career back into the limelight.
And he doesn't seem to be enjoying himself very much. I really enjoy these two actors, especially the man playing Dorrigo, because he's great in this show. And he's very unlikable, but in a very good way. You can tell that they too, like even Ella, older Ella feels trapped in loyalty to Dorrigo or something. She's very loyal to him and wants him to succeed for whatever reason. I don't know, this whole show, it is a character piece without going really in depth. It's quite strange. And I just wanted to briefly talk about the drawings in the book and the character that you just talked about, Rabbit. He's obviously dead by the end of it, but we see him with Dorrigo in the POW camp. And he reminded me a little bit of David Webster in Band of Brothers, except David Webster's a different personality. But he's there to observe and to make sure that people know what's going on in the war. But he does it through absolutely haunting drawings. I do wonder who made these drawings for the show, and I'd be really interested to know, but it doesn't say anywhere, unfortunately.
It's pointed out that even making these drawings would have been punishable by death because the Japanese did not want it to get out what things were like in the POW camps. And there's a passage in the book where Rabbit dies of cholera, I want to say, and they have to burn his body and all of his belongings because it can be contagious. And in the book, Dorrigo tries to throw his sketchbook onto the fire. It's almost symbolic of wanting to get rid of the memories and the evidence of what had happened to everyone as a way to leave it in the past. At the end of the fire, he realizes that the sketchbook has kind of fallen out and it's like a bit singed, but it has survived. And so he ends up carrying it around with him for the rest of the war. So like, again, kind of this whole thing where it's like, as much as you might want to let things go and leave them in the past, they'll come back for you.
You're right. That's so interesting. That just makes me want to read the book.
Yeah, there's little bits and pieces where I was like, I wonder why they didn't include that in the show. But I mean, I guess other people read it and thought different things were important than I thought, which is fine. We all have our different perceptions.
Right. Before the war, again, we get a scene where young Dorrigo and Ella kind of meet her parents, and he does this really lackluster proposal to her while they're in bed. Like, do you want to get married? I don't care if you say yes or no, but do you wanna? It's a little bit of a setup, I think, for what their relationship is going to be. It doesn't necessarily seem loveless to me at this point yet, but you can also feel that it's not super loving either. They're very different people, too. She's from a rich family, and her family has all the connections, and her grandfather. Didn't he write the Declaration of Independence or something, or the Constitution or something like that? So
Yeah.
she's very well connected, and he's just this. I don't want to say he's a hick, but he's not the same. They're from very different backgrounds.
Yeah. I think too, their relationship is really, I feel like you don't see it as often these days, where at the time, if you were of a certain age and you were going steady with someone, you were probably going to marry them. Pretty much everyone got married back then. And so they kind of end up in a situation where she has these connections, and because of her family, he's kind of benefiting from that. And the current of their life is pulling them into this marriage, even if necessarily they're not perfectly suited for each other. And Dorrigo in the book seems fine with that, with being swept along on this current until he meets his uncle's wife, Amy. And that's when it kind of hits him that he could be really happy or really in love and he's not. And that's when he kind of realizes what the difference is.
Yeah, and another thing that kind of pushes them in this direction is the war, right? The impending war. And they have a little conversation where Ella, admits to being kind of scared for him, and he says very stupidly, because when he says it, that it's not going to be true. He says, I'm going to be a doctor, I won't be in danger. You're like, all right, you've said it now.
Yeah. Yeah. Unwise. We also get young Dorrigo meeting Amy, who's his uncle's young wife. So his uncle Keith is, as you might expect, maybe a couple decades older than him, and Amy is about his age. And they hit it off, and we get introduced to this recurring motif. Amy's wearing a red flower in her hair, and we kind of see it throughout the rest of the show. And we also meet the uncle, Keith, played by Simon Baker. And he very foreshadowingly says the phrase to him, "What's mine is yours, Dorrigo." And, these doesn't know yet what's going to happen between Dorrigo and Amy, but
we do at this point. You can just tell already. And they've made a change here from the book, right? Because when Dorrigo meets Amy in the book, he doesn't know that she is his uncle's wife yet when they meet. But when they meet in the show, he does know, because he meets her at the pub in thing that they have. And he's like, I'm looking for my uncle. And she's like, he's out. But they do meet. And you can instantly tell that there's going to be tension. But to be fair, I think Amy's stupid, because Keith, the actor who plays Keith, is quite charming and good looking. And why would you not want to be with Keith?
well, we discussed this, but in the book, we get the background of the characters later. And then it turns out that Amy was working for Keith in this pub that he owns. And he sort of was always flirting with her, and she was always kind of like, no, I'm good. And then one day he sort of initiates sex, and she doesn't super want it, but she does that thing that sometimes women do where we're just like, it's not really worth it, given her job and all that stuff, to fight him off. So I'll just let it happen. And so then she gets pregnant, and then she gets an abortion. And then her and Keith get married anyway, but their marriage is very on the surface from the outside. They have all these friends that they hang out with, like couple friends, and obviously they own the pub together and XYZ and all that stuff. But at night, she doesn't let him touch her, or she tries not to. And so their marriage is not this super stable, loving relationship from which she is deviating when she meets Dorrigo. So I think in a way, like, she's also trapped. And when she meets this young, handsome army surgeon, he's kind of her way out, or at least being in a relationship with him for a brief time gives her this feeling of being young and alive and not stuck in her situation.
I almost wish that they kept that in the show a little bit more, because they've softened Keith's character quite a bit in the show. He's actually quite a nice guy. He's not, at least as far as we the audience get to see, he's not a meanie or an asshole or doing anything inappropriate. I feel like I would have believed her love story with Dorrigo a little bit more if they kept it in.
Yeah, I mean, I think people still grow apart from each other and fall out of love with each other, or they're looking for something else. Like they maybe got married too young or whatever. Like I don't think it necessarily makes the relationship less believable, but it's definitely more understandable in the book why she would stray.
Yeah, and I think it's got something to do with the direction as well. I feel like their relationships, to me, doesn't feel, I mean, with their, I mean, Amy's and Dorrigo's, doesn't feel very loving. It feels kind of like escapism a little bit, which would, if you go with a caged theme, it would still work, but it's just not as compelling.
Well, then the book is like that too. Like I never got the sense that if they had ended up together, they would have lived happily ever after. Like I didn't get that sense at all from the book. And even the way that they meet in the book, they meet at a bookstore and they have this little conversation. And in his mind, he is super attracted to her, but he almost kind of resents her for being this young, vibrant force that is not within the plan for his life. And then he thinks that he'll never see her again. So he's like, well, as long as I never see her again, I can go back to Ella and I can still convince myself that I'll be happy. But then, of course, he does meet her again when he goes to the inn to see his uncle, who he hasn't seen in many years. And that's when he immediately knows that he's going to make this decision that train wrecks his life. So I don't know. I think you're right that they are both trying to get away from something and not necessarily, a deep love for the ages.
No, right. Interesting. Again, I really want to read the book. I wonder how many times I'm gonna say it this episode. But anyway, we skip forward to time in the war. We skip to Thailand in 1943. Dorrigo and the other Australian POWs begin the backbreaking work of building the Burma Railway. And this railway, man, it looks brutal.
Yeah, it was a 415-kilometer stretch of railway line from Thailand to Burma, which is now Myanmar, through some of the toughest terrain in the world. And they did not have machinery. They were working by hand. They were not adequately fed. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have any medicine. So it ended up costing 90,000 civilian lives. So these would be from countries nearby that Japan had taken over, as well as the lives of 12,000 Allied soldiers. And it was built to facilitate the Japanese invasion of India, but it ended up being mostly dismantled after the war.
I wonder if it was a budgetary choice or like a narrative choice, but you don't see any of the other locals, many of whom were also forced to work on the railway.
There was something like 60,000 total POWs, but there was over 200,000 locals, people from Thailand and surrounding area. So yeah, no, it is interesting that we don't see any of those faces.
I wonder though, they keep it quite tight. In the camera work, you don't really see beyond our main characters very often. Like you see them work, but you don't see like a long stretch of railroad or anything. So they kind of get away with it a little, but it still made me kind of scratch my head.
Yeah, definitely feels like a choice.
Yeah. And I also was a little bit confused for a second because remind me and correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't see them become prisoners of war, right?
No.
So my mind struggled to catch up a little bit, even though, like you said, the time periods are they don't even do anything specific to the visuals or anything, but it's pretty clear when we're swapping between timelines. And one thing I quite like is when they switch between old Dorrigo and Dorrigo in the POW camp, between those scenes. You always hear the sounds of the jungle bleed into the older Dorrigo's life, and then it switches back. It's quite smart.
Yeah, effective for sure. Episode 2, old Dorrigo is having an affair with Lynette Mason, who's played by Essie Davis. It's kind of the latest in a long series of decisions Dorrigo has made to kind of self-sabotage his life, because Lynette is the wife of his surgical colleague, Rick. And Rick, who's played by Dan Wiley, goes to Dorrigo's house to tell his wife, Ella, about the affair. And he kind of suggests to Ella that they should sleep together to get revenge on their respective spouses, but she's not into it.
Can I just say how both of them are so lackluster about it? They're just like, they're having an affair. And then he asked her if she knew, and she was like, I suspected. And they're just, you can tell that it's definitely not the first time, for Dorrigo at least. But there's something about old Dorrigo that makes me, even though it's a dick move, and he's kind of a dick in general, I almost can't really be mad at him for some reason, and I can't tell what it is. It's something about the acting. You kind of just feel sad for him instead of angry with him.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something tragic about him, even as an older man. I want to be angry about him cheating, but he's so blasé about it. It clearly doesn't mean anything to him. And she doesn't particularly seem to care either, Lynette. It makes me feel stuff and I can't really decide whether I'm angry or just pity him.
Yeah, this affair comes up early in the book. And one of the things that kind of made me stall out around the 30% point was that Dorrigo's thoughts about Lynette and even his initial thoughts about Amy made me think that, I mean, I don't want to put this on the author, but sometimes you get a vibe that the person whose perspective we're getting doesn't like women very much. And that is not something that I tend to appreciate, because it means that I don't really trust you with the female characters going forward. And so I took a little break because I was like, I don't know. And then I went back to it and it did end up getting better. But yeah, definitely you get the sense that Dorrigo thinks, I mean, to be fair, he thinks little of himself, but you can tell that he also thinks little of the people around him.
Yeah. He seems to be the kind of character who's never satisfied, not with himself, but also not with anyone else. He set this invisible, really high bar, and he doesn't know what it is, the bar, where the bar is, but he also can never reach it. It kind of feels like that.
Yeah.
Young Dorrigo and Amy's flirtation continues, and they start to have an affair. Keith is sort of catching on, but also doesn't really want to admit to himself that he's catching on to it, because Keith in the show really fucking loves Amy. He thinks he's really fucking lucky. Keeps telling Dorrigo, like, man, I'm so lucky. And I'm like, dude, how blind are you? But I think he's not blind. He's just trying not to see.
Yeah. The scene where Dorrigo and Amy's flirtation crosses over into the physical is she cuts her thigh, and then him being a surgeon is like, oh, let me look at it. And it's bleeding, and he leans over and he's kissing the blood. I don't know. Some people might be into that.
There's this whole thing about the ocean in their particular younger self storyline. And I've been trying to figure out what the ocean means, but I don't think there's any. It doesn't necessarily have to be a deeper meaning. But they're constantly swimming in their sea, and there's beautiful skies, and maybe it's his life the way he wants it to be. It feels a little bit like almost idyllic to me.
Also, in the book, there's quite a lot of symbolism and imagery around clocks and the passage of time and stuff like that. And I think that the ebb and flow of the ocean kind of plays into that, where when he's in this affair and having these moments with Amy, he feels like he's sort of frozen out of time, and then he has to go back to his regular life again.
Tough, man. Again, I'd feel sad for him, but I just kind of pity him. Come on, dude, you have choices. Like, make good choices and you won't be as miserable.
That's the thing. When characters continually make terrible choices and trap themselves in a prison of their own terrible choices, and then they use their unhappiness to make everyone around them unhappy, I'm like, get it together.
It makes me wonder if the author, like he said, if he really doesn't like women, or if he did it just on purpose, if he just tried to write a super miserable man. Like, how fun would that be? But also how difficult, because don't you want your main characters to have a semblance of happiness? Because I don't think he has any at any point in life.
No, I mean, his life certainly did not go the way that he planned, for sure. At the POW camp, the situation has rapidly deteriorated. So In episode 1, they are doing really intense backbreaking work, but also they're putting on these little performances for each other at night, like these little plays. And they're having a tough time, but they're relying on their camaraderie with each other. And in the second episode, this is where things have started to really fall apart. So men are starving and dying of vitamin deficiencies and jungle diseases. One of the Japanese officers, Major Nakamura, is played by Sho Kasamatsu, and he has no mercy when Dorrigo tries to prevent sick men from being worked to death. He's like, yeah, I need this many guys to go on this work crew. And Dorrigo's like, well, I don't have that many guys who are well. And the major's like, I don't care, figure it out. And there's a conversation between the major and Colonel Koda, played by Taki Abe, which makes it clear that the Australians are not about to get any relief from the abuse. The colonel says, this is a battlefield, and men die on a battlefield.
This relationship between Dorrigo and the major reminds me a little bit of, is it Bridge on the River Kwai? I think it is, where they also have these kind of talks. And the major, compared to the colonel, is quite soft, but he's not soft. You can see him also struggle with orders and honor and all that sort, because he does sometimes try to get medicine, but then it's like the colonel saying, no, they're not getting any. Do you figure it out? Because I think in Japanese military and just in life, if you don't get your shit together, you're dishonorable and you get punished for it.
The policy or belief system in the Japanese military was that if you surrendered and allowed yourself to be taken prisoner, you were worth less than a dog. And so they thought any Australians who were prisoners didn't deserve to be treated like human beings. And also, I mean, even the Japanese army didn't have enough food and medicine. So best believe they were not giving a portion of what little they had to these POWs. They were like, well, some of you may die, and that's a risk we're willing to take.
And to prove the point, the colonel kind of takes the major outside to teach him something. And they bring over Tiny, who's very ill, like he's probably almost on death's door at this point. And he's naked and he's humiliated already. But he kind of says, look, I'm only teaching. That's what he says to Tiny. And he takes out his katana and just beheads him. Just like that.
Yeah.
In front of everybody.
Yeah, it's super violent. And it's really this articulation of this sense of helplessness that Dorrigo has. Like, he's a trained doctor, he's a surgeon. He was put in this unit initially to help people and to cure people. And now, by virtue of them losing their other commanding officers in the command structure, he is the CO for all of these guys. And he doesn't have the medicine or supplies to help anybody. And so he runs a little hospital and he's doing his best, but ultimately his best does not keep people from dying. And then all of these men standing around and watching this one guy behead their friend brings this whole image of that into clarity.
I also thought there's something strange about the whole happening, because we know that Tiny's dying, like he can barely stand, and he's like drooling, he can't really, and he's saying a prayer like he knows he's gonna die by the hand of this colonel. But it almost feels, even though I know it's not, because I know it's not, but it almost feels like a mercy. Even though it shouldn't be, but it feels a little bit like a mercy because he is dying a violent, really horrible death from disease. But it's not meant to be a mercy, so it's not a mercy, but it still feels like one.
Yeah, and they talk about this a bit in the show, but they go into a lot more detail in the book, where Tiny, when he first came to the camp, was this big, strong, strapping dude, and he was all about, they would have work quotas, and he would try and do like double his quota or whatever. And so every time Tiny hit this insane quota, the Japanese would raise the quota for everybody, and men who couldn't meet the quota would die. And so all of Tiny's friends were like, dude, stop working so hard. You're making it harder for everybody else. And he was like, no, I got to show these Japanese guys what Australians can do, blah, blah, blah. And for a long time, his body doesn't seem to be surrendering to the torments of malnutrition and illness and all that kind of stuff. And he seems to be just this guy who's completely untouchable. And then over time, his body just starts to deteriorate. And so he's this character that has caused the deaths of other people. And then when this killing happens, you kind of wonder what's going through the heads of the other guys around him.
Yeah, I just realized now that they do show a little bit of him showing off to the Japanese in the beginning of the show. And It's sometimes, again, it's all these white guys look the same. So it's sometimes hard to figure out who's who, especially in the dark scenes. But there are a few character moments spread out over the episodes where you get to see a little bit more of their camaraderie and their characters, and there's some silly moments as well. I don't know if it's in another episode or if we just didn't talk about it. It's one of those things where even though they're in a POW camp, there's these moments of levity that they need to be able to survive, and it's so hard to understand if you're just watching it from an outside perspective. But the show tries to include it, but I think in the book it'll be more clear and more in depth.
For sure. Episode 3, we're in the POW camp. Young Dorrigo unsuccessfully attempts to save fellow POW Jack Rainbow, played by Christian Byers, by amputating his leg in less than ideal conditions. As you can imagine, they're in the jungle. He doesn't have a sterile room. He doesn't have sterile tools. And every time he amputates a little bit of this guy's leg, gangrene and infection set in because they don't have the supplies to make that not happen. So he keeps having to cut off more and more. It's pretty grim. And he's continually meeting with the major to ask for resources and continually not getting those resources. So he's doing his best with what he has. But there's a scene that immediately follows this where some of the other men manage to pilfer a steak from somewhere and they bring it to Dorrigo and they're like, yeah, we got this for you, as sort of as a recognition of all the hard work that he's doing to try and save lives. And you maybe didn't get this impression from the show, but in the book, Dorrigo is resentful because all the men have placed him on this pedestal where he feels like he has to turn the steak down because he's like, well, I shouldn't eat it because if I eat it, they'll have this perception of me as not this perfect, amazing savior person that they thought. And he's furious about it because he really wants to eat the steak, as you can imagine. And then they take it away and they spread it among the people in the hospital. And he's so fucking mad that they have made him be this guy who makes decisions like that to come across a certain way when he doesn't feel that way in his heart.
Like in the show, obviously I've not read the book, so I can say this. In the show, you just think that he really cares about his men, but obviously he does not care about the men as much as he cares about himself and their perception of him. So it's interesting. In the show, it just makes him seem humble and likable. It's a strange reaction though. He gets really upset. But yeah, I was like, why is he so mad?
Yeah. I also think it's kind of an interesting thing because in the book, he is so mad at himself for a lot of the things that happen and he feels guilt and shame and he doesn't think much of himself. But I mean, if you think about it, the end result of him turning that steak down is that a bunch of the sick people who needed it got food. And the end result of him doing a lot of the things that he did, even though he didn't want to do them, and he was doing them because it was making him look good, well, the motivation doesn't really matter because the end result was that people were helped. So I think it's kind of this thing where it's like we all hold ourselves to this higher standard in our own minds, but what really matters is your actions towards other people.
I do think in the show, I don't think you can make a show where the main character is really, really unlikable the whole time. So I think it's quite good that in the show you get this perception that at least when he's in prison, he's a good guy. I mean, I won't say that he's not a good guy. He's got some strange thoughts about himself and other people.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think when you're reading the book, you're supposed to have an understanding that part of the reason why he is so unlikable is because he thinks he's unlikable and he's our unreliable narrator. So we're relying on his feelings on the matter.
Right. I sometimes forget that happens in books. Dorrigo faces an inquiry about one of his patients because of a complaint by Rick, which seems to be motivated, at least in part, by the fact that Dorrigo is sleeping with his wife. It's interesting because they do these parallels between POW Dorrigo and Dorrigo now again with this surgery thing that's going on. It's so funny. It's so good.
I think the thing, too, that's more articulated in the book is that Dorrigo is kind of a reckless surgeon. And so much like his the affairs that he has, cheating on his wife, where he's kind of sabotaging his marriage, he's also kind of, I wouldn't say maybe consciously trying to sabotage his surgical career, but part of him is so mad that other people have put him on this pedestal that he wants to like ruin that perception of him.
It's wild. But you can also wonder, is he so reckless because as a POW, that's all he could be? Like it was all or nothing?
Yeah, I mean, possible.
Uh-huh.
We go back to pre-deployment Dorrigo and Amy. There's a little bit of trouble in paradise initially. Their affair is in its super, super early days, and she thinks he's being way too chummy with Keith. And then we get a shower sex scene that you might have seen around the internet. I feel like I've seen it around. People have been sharing it.
Really? I haven't seen that.
People want to see naked Jacob Elordi, I think. So that is probably why.
I mean, fair. The relationship he has with Keith, I wanted him to have that relationship, but also, he can't be fucking Amy at the same time.
Yeah. It's kind of messy.
We switch back to old Dorrigo again, and he's gifted a copy of The Narrow Road to the Deep North by a Japanese delegation. And this scene, man, he says, this woman in this delegation says, I'm sorry for what happened. And he says, it's in the past. Just like that. And
Yeah.
like, do you really believe that, Dorrigo? Because I don't think you do.
Yeah. And we see this circle in the book that's part of this circle symbolism that was also in the original book too. There's quite a lot of it. And I guess that's sort of maybe what part of the ocean symbolism is part of, this like ebb and flow, this idea of you keep coming back and your life keeps echoing in on itself and patterns keep repeating themselves and like everything is circular.
Yeah. I'm guessing it works slightly better even in the book, which is another reason why I want to read it. That's my 5th time I've said that.
Yeah. Rabbit also dies, and there's this big burning pyre outside of the hospital tent where they're burning all these bodies. I'm going to read a quote from the book, actually, because I thought it was pertinent. So in the book, they're having this burning pyre. This is where Dorrigo tries to burn Hendrix's sketchbook, and it doesn't burn. And so with all these bodies heaped up, all the men turn to him to sort of give the eulogy or deliver the funeral service. And he does not feel qualified to do that. But he kind of just says some stuff and he tries to inject religion into it because he thinks that's what you're supposed to do. And he talks about God. And then he's talking to his buddy after and he says, I've got no argument with God, Dorrigo Evans said to Bonix Baker as they pushed and poked the pyre to keep the flames wrapping around the corpses. Can't be bothered arguing with others about his existence or otherwise. It's not him I'm shitty with, it's me. Finishing that way. What way? The God way. Talking about God this and God that. Fuck God, he had actually wanted to say. Fuck God for having made this world. Fucked be his name. Now and for fucking ever. Fuck God for our lives. Fuck God for not saving us. Fuck God for not fucking being here and for not fucking saving the men burning on the fucking bamboo. But because he was a man, and because as a man he was the most conventional of unconventional men, he had instead gabbled God, God, God during his funeral service whenever he had nothing else to say. And about untimely, pointless death, he had found that there was very little that he had to say.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dying of Rabbit made me sad because shortly before he dies, he says to Dorrigo as he's rasping on the hospital bed, he's like, you go take care of the more important ones. Which, oh my God, imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone dies.
In episode 4, a lot of things happen. We first hear these words, you burn me, because it's Amy's favorite poem. And she says it to Dorrigo in the bookstore. It's this little flirtatious moment where you're like, oh, wait a second, that's a flirtatious thing to say, but it's also just actually a poem. So it comes back 3 or 4 times. We see Dorrigo write it in his speech about his book about 1 million times, and Sam and I couldn't read what it said, so I had to go back and watch it in slow motion to see what it says, but it just says, you burn me over and over and over.
Yeah, this is where we hear about Amy's abortion story. She tells it to Dorrigo. And we also get some more of Keith basically figuring out that he's onto them. And from his behavior, like they all know, but it's like a matter of time before it comes to a head, but they're all kind of pretending that that's not going to happen. And the romance is doomed anyway, because Dorrigo is going to be shipping out in 3 days. So it was never meant to last, and it's clearly not going to last.
No, and Keith finally confronts Amy about the affair, but she denies it point blank. She says there's nothing going on, which she knows he knows that there is. But she phones Dorrigo, I'm guessing, where he's stationed, and she tells him that you don't belong to me, you belong to Ella, go back to Ella. So that's different from the book again, right?
Well, that does happen in the book, but he hasn't shipped out yet. So he gets that phone call from Amy and he's like, wow, she's just upset. Like, I'll go talk to her. And so he's going to try and go talk to her. And then someone comes to find him and they're like, actually, I know we said we were shipping out in 3 days, but we're shipping out tonight. And he's like, oh, shit. He's like, I wanted to go and like hash this out. And like, but it doesn't end up happening. He has to leave. And yeah, I think you get more of a sense of like, it's not a full stop on the relationship, or at least Dorrigo would prefer for it not to be.
So he wants to fight for it a little bit more in the book than he does in the show. I feel like in the show he seems, not just in this relationship, but in lots of things, he seems kind of almost despondent to the entire situation. It happens to him and he's like miserable, but he doesn't really kick into action to do anything about anything.
I don't know if despondent is the right word, because despondent is just kind of like you're really like sad and upset. But I think you mean more he's not taking part in the action. He's kind of like paralyzed in just letting the events happen to him.
Right. I know there's a word that I'm looking for. I just can't. It's not coming to my head. Guys, it's not my native language, all right? I'm going to use this once as an excuse, and it's tonight.
Yeah. So in a parallel, old Ella brings up Dorrigo's current affair with him, and it's just sort of muted. It's not a knockdown, drag out fight or anything. She obviously knows that he's cheated on her before, and she's just kind of resigned to the fact,
That's the word. That's the word I was looking for. Just resigned, because that's what Dorrigo is all the time too. Like, stuff happens and he looks really miserable, and then he's like, I guess it's happening. Can't do anything about it.
Like, these people are all victims of their own decisions. They're doing stuff, and then they're like, oh, who could have imagined these consequences about which I can do nothing?
Like, all of them. Like, even Ella. Ella stayed with him for all this time, and you can tell that she knows that that's a decision she made. And she, of course, had her reasons, like they have kids and all that, they have family, and I think she really wanted it to work and all that sort of stuff, but still, she's also trapped in this relationship. All of them are just trapped.
And perception too. Like, she's no different from Dorrigo in that the way other people perceive their relationship, them as like a power couple, her as the power behind the throne, like she's all wrapped up in that too, right?
Yeah, true. That's her personality as much as it is his, I guess.
Yeah.
To other people, at least. In the POW camp, Frank is starting to fall apart. Frank is kind of, I want to say, Dorrigo's closest mate within the group. He's also my favorite character in the show, so I hate this. He is physically starting to fall apart. What happens is he kind of steps on a rocky bit of terrain and he breaks his foot, I think, because they're all emaciated and weak at this point, like there's nothing left of them. And he's been made work leader, but the Japanese tell him to go back because he can't work. He's in no position to do any working. But Rooster and another POW play hooky from working on the tracks. And this snowballs horribly into Frank being beaten to death by a notorious guard called the Goanna, played by Charles Ann. And this is one of those scenes that is impossible to watch. It's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, it felt really long in the book, and it sure also felt long in the show.
They literally do not pull any punches. Like, they show you every single beating he gets, and it kills him. We watch him die, and we hear him cry and moan, and it's horrible. Like, please don't ever, I don't want to ever see that scene again.
Yeah. In the book, he gets beaten so badly and that he dies by suicide. Like, they find him the next morning face down in the sewage pit. Pretty grim. And I think perhaps worth noting is that Frank is an Indigenous character, and he's played by an Indigenous actor. And in the book, they reference this occasionally. Like he has kind of a racist nickname, and the Japanese refer to him as like half caste. And so it is relevant that he is one of the only characters of color among the Australian contingent anyway, of course, like excluding the Japanese. But yeah, and then the fact that his death is caused by someone who is also sort of the odd man out in his group. The Goanna is a Korean soldier who's been conscripted by the Japanese. And so they are the two racially distinct characters in each of their groups.
I hadn't even noticed about, until you just said it, about his nickname, which they purposely leave out of the show, I think. I don't think they use it. Probably wise.
It's quite a racial slur. You can look it up if you want to know what it is.
I won't repeat it. But yeah, he drowns in rainwater. It's really fucking sad. And also, well done to the actor playing this, and also to Jacob Elordi, because this scene is heartbreaking, and they're both excellent in it. You can tell Dorrigo is really, like, he's trying, he's like begging for them to stop, but he realizes that he has no power, even though he's got slightly more power than everybody else who has no power, but it's still no power.
Yeah, it's like, what is even the worth of what little power that he does have if he can't prevent his men from being killed? Also relevant because it comes up later. There's a story that Frank tells as he's dying, and in the book, this is Frank's story. They've all heard this story a million times. He said it constantly. And so basically, before Frank went to war, him and his wife used to go to this fish and chip shop every week, and they would have a little date. And he would always look at the fish in the aquarium and think about how they seemed trapped, and he really wanted to free them. He told the story all the time. And so when he's dying in the show, he tells this story, and then you can tie a little ribbon around it because it'll come back in episode 5. And Dorrigo, meanwhile, receives a letter from Ella with news that Amy and Keith have died in an explosion or a fire or something at the pub where they work. And for him, like, the show must go on. But I feel like the way they do it in the book is that the very, very, very last chapter is Dorrigo receiving this letter. This is clearly the moment that, or for him anyway, the way it feels to him is that, like, this is the moment that his life changed into something that he would never be able to control ever again.
In the show, he receives the letter before Frank dies, but he doesn't open it. And then Frank dies and he opens it the next morning, I want to say, because it's light. And it's like just another blow, just another thing to make him feel hopeless. In episode 5, we start again in the POW camp, and things are not looking up for Dorrigo because he is forced to choose 100 men for a near certain death march because the Japanese need men at another camp because too many of them have died. Which you wonder, right? Like, how do they think this is gonna work? But he goes over to the men and he says, anyone with shoes on can go. But then he still has to go and tap them on the shoulder if they're the ones who have to go on this march. And one of them, a guy called Chum, says to him, we'll meet for a beer after when we get out of this. And Chum dies on the march. And old Dorrigo keeps having dreams about this guy. Before these guys walk off to go on the march, they all come and shake his hand to thank him for his leadership. And it's just the most heartbreaking thing I've ever seen. Because they all know that they're probably gonna die.
Yeah, it's super grim. The next scene we get is that the railway is complete, and Dorrigo dispassionately watches the major collapse due to a long-standing illness that was never treated because of his quote-unquote duty to the empire. And to me, this was just almost like the final nail in the coffin of, like, the major was the bane of their existence. You know, he was the reason for all this weapons grade terrible shit happening to them, in their perception anyway. But really, he was beholden to so many other things, including duty to empire, the orders from his superiors, et cetera, that really what it comes down to is that he was trapped too. He also was not, the direction of his life was not based on his personal choices either.
Then that breaks things off with old Dorrigo, but at least old Dorrigo is off the hook in the inquiry about the surgery. And they're like, we can't really fault you for what you did on the operating table.
The thing about old Dorrigo being off the hook in the inquiry too is that it's just more of other people like cutting him slack that he doesn't feel he deserves.
He almost wants to be punished, right?
In Australia, 1946, we see Dorrigo and Ella's wedding. And we also get a scene, the one that I said to tie a ribbon around, where Dorrigo and his fellow surviving POWs break into the shop from Frank's fish story and they free all the fish into the ocean. It's very symbolic.
Yeah, I did like the scene, I'm not gonna lie. You also get to see who survived. You never see any of the big moments. Like, you don't see the end of the war, you don't see them being captured in the beginning. Like, you skip between all these moments back into ordinary life. It's nice that they get to have the little fish moment because it's obviously also symbolic for their freedom. But are they really free? Is the question. I guess they're not. Also in 1946, we are in Singapore and we see the Guana's execution.
Yeah. Korea was ruled by Japan from 1910 to 1945. And as a result, about 200,000 Koreans fought in the Japanese army in World War II. Some volunteered, but many were conscripted. And in the Gowanus case, he was conscripted and forced into the Japanese army. They were considered second class compared to the Japanese soldiers because the Japanese considered Korean culture to be inferior. And so prior to the Gowanus hanging in the book, he wishes that he had something real to die for because he's been seeing people that he worked with, Japanese who are, going out there and are dying for the emperor and whatever. And he's like, oh, and the Australians died for XYZ or for each other, for camaraderie. And he doesn't really feel like he has anything, like his life doesn't hold that meaning. And there's kind of these parallels between Dorrigo being forced to send men to their deaths and being tortured by it, and the Gowana dying for an execution he was ordered to carry out while those who gave the orders get away scot-free.
Yeah, they don't really bring this home in the show. They should have, I feel. I don't know if I just missed it or if it's really not in there, but I didn't realize that he was Korean until you told me. So it's either because I didn't pay close enough attention because I watched this late at night, or it just wasn't in there.
I don't think they made it super clear. I mean, like his name is Korean and stuff, but I don't think that was like they were very explicit about it. Yeah, so Japan, also 1946, Nakamura and Koda are two main Japanese officers. They reunite and they have this kind of conversation about the idea of the dishonor and being taken prisoner, the idea of they know all these trials are going on where the Allies are holding many Japanese officers accountable for what happened in the POW camps. And they talk about the idea of vengeance versus justice, how, oh, the Allies say that they're carrying out justice, but to us, it feels like vengeance. And who knows what they did during the war and, that kind of stuff. And so they have this whole conversation. And then the book, we get quite a lot of depth. Like you follow Nakamura throughout the entire rest of his life. And you find out that he gets married and he has kids and he actually ends up working for the company that Koda works for. And towards the end of his life, everyone in his community thinks that he's such a great man. He was such a good father. He was such a good husband. He was a volunteer in his community. He was a pillar of the neighborhood, all this stuff. So yeah, I just thought, I guess, they ran out of time in the show or whatever, or they pick and choose like what they prioritize. But I did think that was an interesting sort of way to go in the book.
Yeah, I would have liked to have seen that because it's such a contrast, right, from what he did in the war. It would have been nice to see him deal with the feeling of being put on a pedestal, I guess, like Dorrigo feels. Also, still after the war, but we see Dorrigo bring Rabbit's sketchbook back to his wife Maisie, played by Brenna Harding. And it's probably the softest we see Dorrigo be after Amy. They have a little moment where they talk about notes and rooms and how in a couple, one person is the room and the other one is the note that fills the room. And it's quite sad. You think they are going to have an affair, but you see them just for a second lay in bed together, but they're fully clothed, and then it flashes back to Amy before the war, where Dorrigo and Amy are talking about this island, I think, with a lighthouse on it, where Dorrigo says, there's no one there, we can escape to there and never come back. And it's this little dream of theirs, and it's pretty, and it's also sad.
Yeah, there's actually a really nice passage in the book where after this whole conversation about notes and rooms, they tell you what happened to Rabbit's wife throughout the rest of her life. And they're like, yeah, She got remarried. She outlived him too. And she threw Rabbit's medals in the fire and they kind of got melted down. And then it tells you over time, the house burnt down and then the medals got covered in dirt and then like flowers grew over them and etc. So it kind of gives you this idea of like the passage of time. And they talk about how the entire rest of her life, she never finds that love again that she had with Rabbit or finds that person that she fits with. And towards the end of her life, she kind of forgets his face, but she never forgets like what that feeling was.
Sad and also pretty.
Yeah. Old Dorrigo tells Ella that they're sort of like, as much as they've both like hurt each other over the years, or really Dorrigo just hurt Ella for the most part, but they understand each other. So they're having this little conversation and he tells Ella that he thought he once saw Amy after the war. And Ella tells him that Amy came to see him once and found his wife and child, and then she went away and just never came back. And it's a super interesting choice because in the book, he does see Amy after the war and she also sees him and they don't speak to one another. And it's this whole thing where Keith had told Amy that Dorrigo was dead, that he had died in the war. And then Keith almost immediately died in this pub fire. And initially it was thought that like maybe Amy had also died because some other people had died in the fire and they couldn't identify them. And so, but then it turned out that of course Amy did not die. She survived. But Ella wrote to Dorrigo and was like, oh, I found out that it definitely was Amy who died. So sad. And so Dorrigo never looked for Amy because he thought she was dead. And then she was kind of upset because she was like, well, she over time found out that he had survived the war because he was kind of this famous war veteran. And she was like, well, why did he never look for me? And so when they kind of see each other later and he can't bring himself to speak to her, and she kind of is like, well, I don't want to talk to him either. And then Amy like goes off into the rest of her life and they never see each other again.
I quite like that idea from the book where Dorrigo, in Amy's eyes, becomes what Dorrigo thinks he is, worthless and shitty.
Yeah.
It's another circular moment where it actually becomes true.
Yeah. And Dorrigo takes his granddaughter to see this exhibition of Rabbit sketches, and he gives the speech that he's been working on this whole time about Rabbit and his time as a POW, etc.
I was quite emotional at this exhibition as he speeches because in the reflection of the glass of the house they're in, or the museum, I guess, he sees all the guys, all the POWs, even the ones who died. And then, after his speech, we see young Dorrigo after the war, where he thinks he sees Amy in a crowded, I think they're at like a station or something, it's very busy. And he sees her and he keeps looking at her and like she sees him too, I think, but he's not sure if it's her. And then it kind of flashes back and forth between that and old Dorrigo as he's remembering that. And then he's in the car with his wife and his kids, I'm assuming. And then there's a car crash. No? He's not with his wife? It's just him in the car? It's just him in the car. And he's driving back home, probably. And I could tell something was going to happen, and it did, because he gets hit by a car and he gets, swung out of through the windshield. And he dies on the road. And that's how it ends. But as he dies, we see him and POW Dorrigo in the jungle together, and there's this peace there. Like he finally finds peace in death. I guess, maybe? I don't know what they're trying to say with that image, but it's pretty.
Yeah, in the book, he doesn't die right away. It takes him 3 days to die in the hospital. And so he kind of gets this prolonged life flashing before his eyes kind of moment where he's dying and he doesn't really know what's going on. And it's kind of like different bits and pieces of his life are flashing by in a kind of kaleidoscopic way. And then after he dies, that's when we get the chapter of young Dorrigo getting the letter saying that Amy is dead. And that's kind of how the book ends.
Wow, that's a really different framing. I think you would have to do it that way because I don't think it would make much sense in the show if you structured it like that. Although it would be kind of an interesting, oh, here's the moment where everything changes. I don't know. Anyway, that's the end of the show, guys. We have some notes. The book is in part based on Flanagan's dad's wartime experiences as a prisoner. And actually, Dorrigo was based on a real man, on Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Edward Barry Dunlop, who was well known for his medical work with the Australian prisoners of the Japanese and the subsequent welfare work on their behalf after the war. So this man actually did exist.
I think it's a loose basing, but yeah.
Yeah. I do wonder if you want to mention this next bullet point.
Oh my God. There was I think Flanagan, in doing the research from the book, read somewhere that when people starve, basically all of your fat goes away, obviously. And so that includes the fat on your butt. And if you have a jungle disease where you're shitting a lot and you're super, super skinny, your asshole basically just hangs out. And he describes this several times in the book. I'm not kidding. It's not once. It gets described several times that their anuses are protruding or whatever. And I was like, dude, I get it. They're really skinny. I got it.
I'm sorry for making you talk about it. I just wanted our audience to know.
Yeah. Well, you know what? He really doesn't pull any punches on making it clear how brutal the Australian POW experience was. So I guess that's what we're meant to glean from that.
We're rating the show, why is it so dark, out of 10? Because it is so fucking dark. And why is it so fucking dark? We don't know.
Right. Is it never daytime in the jungle or anywhere else?
It's always night when you're a POW. It's always shit. There's never any sunlight. I'm gonna rate the show. I'm gonna rate it 8. Why is it so dark, out of 10? Because I really did like this show and it made me think quite a bit. I also think I liked it because we talked about it quite a lot after, which always changes my perspective of it. I thought the acting was great. It was nice to see Jacob Elordi in something meaty, even though his character was kind of sad and not there sometimes. But the acting was good. I liked the female characters, even if they were kind of victims. The music was really touching and emotional. We haven't even talked about it, but it's quite a big part of the show. I don't know, I like the structure. I like the way we have 3 different timelines. And I think I want to watch it again, so that's why it gets 8.
Yeah, I would say I liked the way they structured the timelines and the way they kind of wove everything together. I think it was easy to follow. I think the parallels were really effective. I will say that, I don't know, I've been finding that after my initial uncertainty about the book, when I did end up finishing it, I don't know if I would say it's one of my favorite books I've ever read, but it really did make me think a lot. And we have talked a lot about it offline after we finished watching the show and after I finished reading the book. And I've certainly found myself coming back to it and thinking more about the characters and about the symbolism and the meaning and stuff like that. So to me, that means the author did a really good job of creating this book that hangs on to you and that you carry with you for a little while. I don't know if the show did the book the amount of justice that I wanted it to do. And also, man, it was really fucking dark a lot of the time. So I think I'm going to give this show maybe a 6.5. Why is it so dark out of 10? But I would give the book probably an 8.5. Why is it so dark out of 10?
I'm really interested to come back to this after I finish the book and see if I've changed my mind. But I will tell you if I do ever finish the book, because I'm reading too many books. If I do finish it, I will tell you what I think.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, and I think too, going back to the show after the book, you can really sort of put together, you know what the themes are. You can be like, oh, cool, this foreshadowed this thing that happened later. In your mind, you can draw connections a little better. Are you reading anything?
Am I reading anything new since yesterday when we last recorded? No, I'm not. How about you? Are you reading anything new?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of. It's next on my docket. I'm going to be reading The Devil's Brigade by Robert H. Adelman and Colonel George Walton. And it's about the force that ended up becoming the Green Berets after the Second World War. And there's a couple of movies based on this book, I gather, that we may cover soon on the pod.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to another episode of Rosie. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can rate us 5 stars if you'd like. We'd love you very much if you did. You can send this episode to Jacob Elordi if you know him. You can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com, and you can find us on IMDb, which I keep thinking is really cool, but nobody ever looks at it. So please go look at it and rate us. Thank you. See you next week.
Bye.